Just 2 weeks ago, we had the supplementary budget where we were told about the Herculean challenge facing South Africa. I think this is somewhat disingenuous, that there is nothing Herculean about the way in which South Africa needs to get its arms around the problem. In fact, the problem is relatively straightforward. What's needed is action. And the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, says our Herculean task is to stabilize debt. Well, yes, the Herculean task is to stabilize debt, but that is actually a consequence of an action. You stabilize debt if you stop spending. So South Africa's job is to actually stop spending and start growing. And guess what? If you stop spending and start growing, your debt will stabilize and your debt to GDP ratio will normalize. So I'm going to be uncharitable about the Minister of Finance's observation here and saying he's sort of stating the obvious, and he's not really laying out what the real problem is. The real problem is a government that is addicted to spending. And that addiction to spending is captured by, here's South African government spending as a percentage of GDP, and here's South Africa's tax revenue. Now, again, I'm going to sort of interfere with the Minister of Finance's words. He speaks about this as the crocodile jaws. And the crocodile jaws is the widening of spending versus income. And in our personal capacities, we know if we do this, if we keep spending more and more and more versus what we earn, and we look at our balance sheet, it's a problem. And it's called a growing debt to income ratio, which eventually you can't afford. And that's the territory South Africa has got into. We have moved into a debt to income or a debt to GDP ratio that is unaffordable. That's shown on the right-hand side. When countries get into this 50 to 60% territory, that's usually the time that ratings agencies are a little bit worried. When they get into this 90, 100% territory, this is what economists refer to as the point of no return, because your interest charges run ahead of your ability to service the debt. And so you get into runaway debt. And so here's Tito Mboweni's, the top of his hippopotamus jaw. And the suggestion is that they can moderate that debt and will actually get into this active solution, which will be far more palatable and that we can afford this circumstance. I said I was going to play with his words or his term. I don't think that this is a hippopotamus. I think that this is a crocodile. And the crocodile has some of the most powerful sets of jaws in the animal kingdom. The way that they kill is by clamping down. They don't let go. And they generally don't kill with the bite. They kill by grabbing hold of the victim and then taking that prey to the bottom of a water body where they drown them. And that is the reality that South Africa faces as an economy. And I'm not trying to be poetic or dramatic here. South Africa has got itself into an unsustainable position that requires dramatic remedial action. There's my throwaway is the job of economists is to depress people, so my work here is done. But let me be less flippant and more substantial by taking you to ways in which we might get out of here. So this very quickly, this data shows you what happens when countries get above 100% debt to GDP. And where the lines stop is that the country has defaulted. So South Africa, as things stand, is heading into default territory. And it puts us into the shape and nature of looking Argentinian, not yet Venezuelan. And Argentina, you know, it defaulted on its international debt in the early 2000s. It's getting back into the habit of defaulting on international debt. They're running with 50% inflation rate. The stats are, in fact, the IMF and World Bank say they don't believe Argentina's numbers. Argentina really has turned itself into a rogue state, not yet failed, but it's a rogue state. And South Africa is worryingly walking down that road. I've made this point about our interest charge as a percentage of budget. So every 20 cents, 21 cents of every rand we send in tax revenue now goes to servicing our interest bill. It is the single biggest item on the fiscus. Let me turn then to some slightly more optimistic observations and some realistic commentary about what we can do from an investment perspective. The optimistic observation is that what I'm telling you is not new or novel. There is nothing that I'm making in these observations that markets don't already know. The currency is one of the best ways of getting this barometer. And you can see what the rand did from the start of the year going into COVID-19, where even in February, perhaps early March, there was a prospect that if the world could normalize, South Africa's budget was still somewhat believable, and we might be able to keep the ratings agencies off our backs. Of course, that changed spectacularly, and there was a lot of hand-wringing that timing of the ratings agencies was appalling, that as we went into lockdown, Moody's called us into sub-investment grade. I think that that's looking past the fact that Moody's, S&P, and Fitch have been calling us out not for months or quarters, but for years on our spending and debt behavior. But yes, the timing was unfortunate, but it was actually our own doing. And with that, we got a blowout in the rand. You might remember the late March and April days of almost 20 rand to the dollar. And what's interesting is the recovery in the rand from then to now, where we're now hanging around in 17 rand territory. And there's two things going on. I'll share with you in a moment our rand forecast. The first is that this is spectacularly oversold. That at 19 rand to the dollar, the domestic currency was very weak, and it corresponded with what we were seeing in the likes of the Brazilian reais, Indian rupee, Russian ruble, and others. So the recovery that you see here has got less to do with South Africa than it has to do with a recovery in global risk appetite for emerging markets, and in particular commodity-based emerging markets. The second aspect that helps explain the improvement in the rand performance is that South Africa has access to a substantial global capital pool. By some estimates, at least $7 billion is immediately available, is immediately available in emergency funding. And that will take the form of multilateral agencies, the IMF, the African Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, providing multilateral funding to South Africa's national treasury. And that provides some silver lining to what is a very dark cloud. How do we get that cloud not to lighten, but to actually clear the way and reveal a bluer sky? Our Minister of Finance needs to stop talking and start doing. And he knows what he needs to do. It sits in his 77-pager that National Treasury tabled at the end of 2019. And it's all of these structural reforms. None of them are what we would call radical. None of them are IMF imposed. All of them will help substantially improve South Africa's competitiveness. They would be good for business. They would be good for employment. They would be good for growth. The problem that South Africa faces is that we are in the habit with so much else. We're in the habit of talking about these remedies rather than getting on with them. And there really is low-hanging fruit here, including the likes of unbundling of Eskom, letting the renewable IPPs get underway. South Africa receives some of the highest photovoltaic irradiation in the world, yet we generate 98% of our energy from coal-fired stations, and the release of telco spectrum. And just look what happened in the first couple of days of COVID, that policymakers were galvanized into action to release some of this telco spectrum. So why not all of it? Why not more? The other silver lining is that South Africa has deep capital markets, and these deep capital markets provide some backing, even if it is inconvenient backing, to South Africa's funding of our fiscal circumstance. I won't dwell here. I'll make this point very quickly and then finish up with some investment comments. What I'm alluding to in talking about South Africa's deep capital pools is that we have a pension fund industry whose assets represent about 100% of GDP. And just some small part of this pension fund industry being allocated to look after South Africa's fiscal strain could really take the thumb off South Africa's financial throat. The deep risk that we face in that is it is seen as an easy win and treated as free money. And if that happens, we run the risk of, well, in the background, I've got the Venezuelan picture. If that happens, we run the Venezuelan risk. So there is a very real prospect of doing substantial things here to remedy and relieve South Africa's financial circumstance, but it has to be done with absolute discipline